You're essentially solving yesterday's problems with yesterday's thinking, but in a world where yesterday doesn't exist anymore.
All of us as consumers, we think we are optimizers, but actually we are risk minimizers.
What's interesting about it, and the reason it matters, is because when you've microdosed novelty, uncertainty in small amounts, when the proper stuff shows up, instead of freaking out or freezing, it's almost like you've built this muscle. Oh, what a great question. I very rarely get asked questions that I've never been asked before. That's great.
Storywork is brought to you in partnership with Slingshot. Slingshot are Australia's creative media experts, and having worked successfully with them for years, I'm thrilled to have them on board.
You're listening to a DM podcast.
Well, hi friends, my name is Matt Jones and welcome to another episode of Storywork. This might be your first time, in which case welcome, or you might have heard our incredible conversations with Dom Pym and Zara Seidler. Either way, it's great to have you here. And today we're going to talk about change. Change is a constant. I know it's a cliche, but even in a world that is always changing, I still feel like we are going through a particularly changey moment. And how we navigate the next period of business and life is going to be dependent on how well we deal with change, how we handle the changes that will happen to us, and how we drive whatever changes we seek to make. Now, whenever I'm trying to figure out what's going on in the world, I tend to think about Michael McQueen. This is an era of almost endless self-help advice, but I still turn to Michael's books and listen to him speak before just about anyone else. So today I wanted him to come on the podcast and focus on two of the ideas he's really thinking about a lot at the moment. The first is about the power of embracing novelty. Michael thinks that curiosity can make us more prepared for change, can make us more resilient and more flexible in the face of enormous uncertainty. The second idea is about the power of leading with vulnerability, how being vulnerable, not certain, can help you take people with you as you seek to change their minds and maybe change their behaviors. So from microdosing novelty to rethinking the art of persuasion, here is my chat with the very brilliant Michael McQueen. Michael McQueen, I'm very conscious I sit across the desk, one bald man looking at another, mostly bald man that we have known each other a very long time.
Yes.
More than 10 years. And you've written 10 books. You've spent the last 20 years giving thousands of keynotes and giving great thought leadership. And for me, the common theme so often is this sense of change.
Yes.
What I want to talk about today is this central notion of change, but I want to look at it through two lenses. Mm-hmm. First, how do we deal with it?
Yep.
Because if there's one thing we're going to have to deal with a lot in the next few years, it's going to be even more change than the last few years made us swallow.
Yep.
But then the second thing is, how do we create change? And you said something really interesting to me when we were chatting before this podcast, that actually being open-minded is not something that comes naturally to you, even though you know how important it is.
Yeah. And so you've got different ways of understanding openness. So you've got natural openness. So if you look at the big 5 personality styles, you've got openness as one of the core traits. And on that scale, I'm actually very low. I'm not a particularly open person. I love routine. I love predictability. I love the status quo. And it's funny in speaker land, and you'll have seen this over the years too, how often you see a speaker on stage who is speaking with great authority about something that they actually struggle with themselves. And sometimes you can see that and think, is that a level of hypocrisy or a lack of congruity? I think the reality is we teach what we most need to learn. And so for me, trying to be open-minded and curious and adaptable, because it's not natural for me, means that I can teach from it, I guess, with a level of authority, because I've had to work it out. I've had to constantly push myself to do it. And so that, I think, is better than someone who's just one of these wonderfully free-spirited, take anything as it comes in life type people. And I wish I was more like that. A lot of us aren't. And I think in corporate leadership, a lot of corporate leaders aren't. The things that made them successful as corporate leaders, they're linear, they're methodical, they're the A-type driven personalities. They like to control all the variables. Means that their blind spot is that, like me, they're not necessarily naturally curious.
So we need to be open-minded in the face of change. we're also in a world where we need to project confidence. We need to project expertise. Why is it so important to master this ability to change your mind?
Yeah. Well, I think the reality is if you aren't willing to change your thinking, you're essentially solving yesterday's problems or with yesterday's thinking, but in a world where yesterday doesn't exist anymore. And so you're using a playbook, and the phrase I often use, or the term with clients, is that you can't find new treasure if you're using an outdated map. And if you think about our map being our assumption set, our thinking, that the playbook that's worked for years, if you're just doubling down on what worked yesterday or the year before and trying to execute it more effectively in the future, the landscape's shifted. And so the challenge for all of us is how do we keep our thinking fresh and agile and probably as humble as well as curious. Like humble to realize that what worked in the past might not work in the future. That's confronting. That requires us to lay down some of our ego, because some of the very things that have worked well for us, we then attach our identity to. We are successful because of, and then you list out the things that you've done. I'm like, well, that worked then. The context has shifted. And so I think for all of us, that constant willingness to be curious and open-minded and humble, again, it's not a natural posture, especially in this sort of Western corporate, I'm going to project absolute certainty mindset. Interestingly, the research around this shows that actually leaders who lead with some level of doubt, vulnerability, honesty, transparency, tend to trigger the same things in their teams. It means people step forward. They bring their best ideas to the table. That's when innovation starts.
I wonder sometimes if people think they're not going to get to that position of leadership. They listen to what you're saying and go, yeah, I kind of get that. If I'm the authoritative leader, like if I'm the new incoming CEO of Apple, yeah, I've probably got permission to stand on a stage and say, I don't know everything. And everyone goes, well, you probably do because you're the new CEO. But do people wonder if they're not going to get that opportunity if they don't project that absolute sense of certainty and expertise?
It is tricky because there is a little bit of that fake it till you make it that you often see. And we've all been there early in our careers. When you walk into rooms, you're like, I'm not sure if I'm meant to be here. I don't know if I'm qualified enough to be in the room. And then sometimes that leads into imposter syndrome. The reality is there's probably a little place for almost leading with the physicality and letting the belief follow. Sometimes you need to walk in with your chest out. I've got something to add here. I'm going to own my space. I'm keen to learn. I'm keen to listen, but I also want to contribute. I'm not going to just stand back and be a weak, passive voice in the room. But at the same time, if that bravado then gets to the point where it's almost like you can't listen anymore because now you've built this solid facade and you've always got to have the best answers. Often, and you see this in people where they project that sense of flawlessness, and it's actually a very brittle facade. There's a sense of constantly need to defend against being found out or caught out. It's not a strong, well-grounded place. I mean, the best leaders and the best humans are the ones who are sure about what they know. Their convictions are strong. And in fact, once you've got strong convictions, it gives you permission to be curious. It's when people aren't sure of who they are, they tend to gravitate toward this projected sense that they're all over the details. They're in control, they're flawless, and then all it takes is one thing.
But it actually comes across as almost an insecure 100%. And brittle sense of expertise.
Yeah.
So talking about being humble, talk about having to change your own mind.
Yes. It's it's something we all have to do. And I look back, there's a few things I've changed my mind over in the last little while. In fact, I was thinking of it this morning as I peeled my mouth tape off as I woke up. As I've been taping my mouth for the last few months. Have you tried this?
I have not.
Okay, so mouth tape.
Welcome to Mouth Taping, a new podcast about
tape. I know. So when I first heard about it, in fact, I'm doing a segment on the future of sleep on Sunrise a few months ago. And so I was reading about all the different things, the fads that are sort of taking over the sleep world, the sleep industry, right? There's a whole industry of sleep. And it's all these beds that have got, a water that flows through them and changes the temperature as your body changes throughout the night. All very fancy stuff. But talked about mouth tape. And I read it and I thought, this feels like a massive fad. All the people I read about who were using it were the influencer types who also do ice baths and, like keto diets. Right. And well, more so, I look at them and think, I'm not that person. I'm not the extreme ice bath, keto diet human. So just because they're doing it doesn't mean I'm probably going to be open to it. Until my mother-in-law said, I've tried this mouth tape and I'm sleeping better than I've ever slept. I'm like, she is not an ice bath, keto diet human. She's very sensible, very measured. I'm like, well, if she thinks it works, I'll give it a try. And honestly, so good. So I've started to snore like a lot of dudes at a certain age. And it stopped instantly. And I've never slept badly. I've never been one who's woken up with that dusty sense of I'm tired, but I sleep so much better with it. But it did take that moment of I'm now someone who, and then fill in the blanks, uses mouth tape. And it's all these little things that you look back and to take on something new, you've got to give up something old. And that's an example of just something very simple. And even in the last few months, I've changed my thinking about, I used to diss it. I was like, who tape your mouth? It's like wearing a muzzle to sleep. And then suddenly I'm now the person at parties saying, hey, you got to try this. It's really cool. Another thing I've changed my mind about. So I've always been, because I'm from the country, I didn't grow up in Sydney. And so I prided myself on being someone who doesn't close or lock their doors at night. I'm like, I'm not one of these neurotic, terrified people who lives with anxiety. I'm like, just leave the doors unlocked, especially in summer. Anyway, so I'm chatting with a mate of mine who actually is a cop, but he grew up about 5 streets away from where we live now, has moved out of the area since, but knows the area well. And I was telling him, because he's a real no-nonsense, like rough sort of cop, he's just like very pragmatic. And I was telling him about this, and his face just dropped. He went, sorry, dude, what? You don't lock your doors at night? I'm like, yeah, no, I don't lock on my doors. Our suburb's really safe. He's like, so just so you know. And he started to go through some of the crimes in the last 2 or 3 weeks in our suburb. I'm like, are you serious? And it was just something about that conversation. I've been a door locker for the first time in my life. And it's not even a terrified thing. It's not even an anxious thing. It's just a prudent, sensible thing. And I think what changed my mind, because my identity was rooted, I'm not someone who does that, to now I am someone who does that. What changed my mind? It was the person who communicated the idea to me. I trusted them. They had credibility. I saw them as being like me. If they were a neurotic person, I've had so many people over the years say, you've got to lock your doors, but they're the neurotic people. I don't listen because they're not like me. And that tribalism thing that kicks in.
So you changed not just your behavior, but your sense of identity. You 100%. Went from being, I am Michael, a man who does not lock his doors in summer, to I am Michael, I lock up at night.
Yeah.
That's a profound shift.
Yeah.
Why do so many of us get stuck? Why do so many of us get stuck and find ourselves unable to make shifts that often would be better for us, better for our families, better for the planet, better for something that matters to us? Why do people get stuck?
Well, you often hear that the reason for that is because we're all just afraid of change, whether it's changing a habit or a process or changing our mind or whatever it is. And we hear that so often we just assume it's true, and it's not. So we're not afraid of change as humans. What we're afraid of that typically causes us to dig our heels in, to push back, to not adjust as the reality around us changes, is a fear of loss. So the moment there's loss involved in change, that's when that trigger of reactance or resistance is kicked off in all of us. And for some, it's stronger than others. And so there are 3 losses that typically, I've certainly found in the client work that I've done around this stuff, but also just the research that I've read over the years. 3 losses. So the loss of familiarity is massive, the loss of power, and the loss of dignity. So if you look at those, the loss of dignity is about ego. This idea of, again, if I am this person and I need to admit that maybe I was wrong, how do I change my mind without losing face? And so you've got to give people the ability to feel right in the process of changing their minds, because our brains would actually rather feel right than be right. And so if you're trying to get people to be open to change, how do you give them a path to save face while they change their mind? The second one, the loss of power, is massive. The moment there's a sense that if I change, I might become less relevant or less necessary, less essential. I'm losing some of the power I've currently got. It's amazing. If deep down we know it's a good idea, we'll dig our heels in. But it's the first one, that loss of familiarity, that I think is so often involved. This idea that I know the status quo. If you want me to move outside of that, that's unfamiliar territory. And I can ask her a great example of this recently. I was chatting with a colleague. She's an exercise physiologist. So she gets called to go in and basically adjust people's workspaces when their necks are messed up and their wrists are sore, and because their monitor's too high or their keypad's in the wrong thing or desk height is all out of whack. So she'll go in typically by request from the person who is in pain. They're often on a treatment plan for all sorts of injuries. So she'll go in and it takes her no time at all. She'll be like, if we just move your monitor here, move your keyboard there, desk down a bit, chair a bit higher. And at the end of the consult, the people will say, oh my goodness, I just feel so different. I wish I'd done this 2 years ago. And so she'll often go into an organization and do a series of these all in a row. And then she notices within an hour or two, she'll walk back through that floor to head back out of their building. And 90% of the people have put their desks back to where they
back
were.
A bit, the monitor's down again.
Absolutely, because it's unfamiliar. And in as humans, we'll often, we'll even opt for unhappiness over unfamiliarity. We'll stick with things that we hate but it feels familiar. So we'll stick with them just because our brains love familiarity.
I think this is such a critical point, and it's part of a bigger conversation about the gap between things that sound right and things that actually work. We'd all say that we want to be happy, but it turns out what we really crave is the comfort of familiarity. Rory Sutherland is a wonderful thinker in this space of behavioural science and behavioural economics. He wrote a book called Alchemy, and one of the points that always stuck with me from his book was how when we are asked about decisions, we'll say, well, I made the decision that I thought was optimal for me. But the truth is often that people make the decision that minimizes the risk to them. So for me, the point about this is whatever we're doing as leaders, as marketers, as brand builders, as builders of campaigns, movements, whatever it is, we maybe need to focus a little bit less on the things that we think are going to be inspiring to people and quite a lot more on the things that will be reassuring to them. This is such a key thing, I think, for not just people trying to drive change away from a negative. So we think, all of us as consumers, we think we are optimizers, but actually we are risk minimizers. I thought about this a lot with 4 Pillars. I'm like, look, as much as I want to believe that someone walks into a Dan Murphy's and puts back the bottle of Hendrix and picks up the bottle of 4 Pillars because they are excited to try something different, the reality is they're more likely to put back the bottle of 4 Pillars because of the risk that at first sip, they won't like it. So actually, I've got to focus much more on reassurance and much less on inspiration. I think it's all about positivity, but actually a lot of it is about 100%. Safety.
Yep. And so I think for all of us, we've got to be aware of what are the things that trigger that fear of the new. How often are interruptions or disruptions a blessing in disguise? And rather than wait till they hit, how do you try and disrupt yourself a little bit?
Look, I just got back from a week in New York, as you know, and I've used to live in New York and have tried to get there every couple of years. I also, for the last 3 years, have chaired the City of Sydney's Business Advisory Committee. And so you're sitting there thinking strategically about urban planning and the economy and how you create a more vibrant hospitality scene and all these things. And then you go to New York, and this is a city that just sort of never changes. And yet the most profound change in New York's hospitality scene and dining scene is the outdoor dining that was caused by the interruption of COVID. And you're like, all of these geniuses sitting around trying to plan, how do we make our city better? And what it actually took was a pandemic forcing restaurants to create these little cabins for people to dine outside. And then one change of the law, they're now permanent. The whole of downtown Manhattan has this street energy it didn't used to have because of a pandemic. And so again, to your point, not just as individuals, but our collective institutional curiosity still gravitates towards the familiar until something forces a disruption and a change. I want to come to driving change, but I've got one more question about this stuckness. You've talked in your work about this idea of identity motivated reasoning, reasoning that helps us reinforce our sense of who we are in the world. What I want to ask you is this getting worse? Are we in a landscape now driven, I don't know, by the algorithm, by anxiety, by this absolute sense of the polycrisis and change is out of control? Is all of this making this reinforcedness of stuckness worse, not better, at a time when we actually need to get better at being more open?
It'd be hard to make a case that it's not. However, I take comfort in some of the work being done by a couple of groups. One is a research group based in the UK, and they've got offices around the world now called More in Common. And More in Common have looked at tribalism, and especially what they call hidden tribes. So it's not just polarized like left and right, Republican, Democrat, Labor, Liberal. There's just all these tribes in between. And their work has looked at how many people are actually in the middle, not polarized, and actually really tired, really sick of it. And in fact, the number of people, Jay Van Bavel, who's a researcher at over at NYU, has looked at this as well. He talks about the fact that the vast bulk of the content you see on social media is from a vanishingly small percentage of the population. So you can get the sense that we're all so polarized, the majority of people are just in the middle, not radicalized, not crazy, just getting on with life. And so even though I think there is a sense that we are more in our corners, a bit more tribally triggered, there is some encouragement, I think, that's sometimes a projection online that doesn't reflect reality. So if we just, maybe the optimists in us can cling to that. Maybe we're not also polarized. However, I do think if you sort of set that aside, this limbic response of our brain, this response of, what has kept us safe alive as a species from millennia, the fight and flight reflex. This part of our brain that responds to threat. And we do fight and flight when it's a physical threat. When it's a psychological threat, this notion, people don't want to hear what they don't want to hear. And the moment I'm exposed to ideas or information from the other side or from a source that challenges my assumptions, that forces me to have to rethink, our limbic system, our limbic response isn't fight and flight, it's deny or defend. And how quickly that's being triggered. And I think there's a couple of things that are making us more trigger happy, more reactive to things. Partly we're overwhelmed. There's that sense of just people, when you all know this, when you're tired, when you're fatigued, your reactions are less measured. Your executive function is impaired. The part of your brain that actually tells your limbic system, just calm down, like don't fly off the handle. So there is that, the sense that we are fatigued, that we're overwhelmed. The other interesting thing, there was some research I came across during the first lockdown in COVID, was some research done at the University of Chicago, where they actually looked at the influence of isolation on people's amygdala. So your amygdala is the part of your brain that is the primary sort of element of your limbic system. It's where a lot of those fight-flight reflexes come from. What they found is the shape of the amygdala changes depending on a whole bunch of things. But one of the things they tracked was the impact of isolation. So when you are not solidly connected in community with other humans, your amygdala essentially becomes heightened, more sensitive. And so at one time you've got and we hear so much about, probably one of the things that worries me most in society right now is the younger generation who are lonely, isolated. And you can talk about all the mental health risks around that. You can talk about the social cohesion, the failure to thrive of 23-year-olds who are in their, at home in the basement gaming rather than just hanging out with their friends. There's a lot of that going on. But the impact on brain function is interesting and really concerning because it means that amygdala response, that limbic reaction, when you're not in community and connected with real humans, I'm not online, I'm talking real humans in community, your reactions get warped.
And this goes to a really almost physical understanding of what it means to be open, right?
Yes,
and where, we're both parents of kids and wrestling with social media bans and all those things. But actually, it's more than that, isn't it? It's the Netflix culture. It's the Uber Eats culture. It's the culture that means you can stream content online, you can game online, you can pretty much explore the whole world from your basement, from your living room, which is the antithesis of being open and being out in the world and not being isolated physically, socially, intellectually. So I think that's a wonderful pivot point to go on a personal level, embrace openness. And I want to talk in a bit about some of the things that you've done as a human to be more open. But let's then shift to the leadership perspective. I remember reading Daniel Pink's book years ago, Drive, where he talks about the positive things that motivate people. And his central thesis was once people have enough money, it's no longer money. It's about giving them purpose. It's about giving them a sense of autonomy. It's about helping them with a sense of mastery. But what I love about what you've talked about with the sense of loss and the dislike of loss is they're almost the antonyms of those things. You're like, but actually they're not going to do the thing you want them to do if they're going to feel it is unfamiliar, if 100%. It's going to feel they're going to lose power, lose dignity. So talk to us now as the leaders we are, because all of us, as we said at the top, we're all trying to lead some form of change, whether someone's listening to this and they want to shift their career and they want people to take them seriously as a professional in a different field, whether they're trying to raise investment for a new business, whether they're trying to get a promotion, whether they're a CEO or a founder trying to lead a company, an educator. Everyone's trying to get someone else to change what they think, change what they feel, change what they do. You've talked about this idea that nothing changes until minds change. What are leaders getting wrong about driving change and changing minds?
Well, I think probably the first thing, and it's such a natural thing for many of us to do, especially in a Western context, because we are a product of the Enlightenment, this idea that, Francis Bacon, knowledge is power, this idea that, if we can just educate people better. I mean, there's a core assumption in Francis Bacon's work that if someone's not being reasonable or seeing logic, then there's a knowledge gap. And so if you can just plug that knowledge gap, they'll see the light, they'll change their mind, they'll shift their view. And that'd be nice if it was true, but it's not. I mean, it's never been true, but it's less true now than it was even 40 years ago. We are so skeptical. We are so fiercely individualistic. The moment we feel like someone's impinging on our agency, we push back so quickly, this reflex in all of us. So the things that might have worked for our grandparents' generation as leaders, where you could just tell people to do something because that's what was expected.
That almost deference
100%.
to authority, deference to knowledge, perceived expertise is replaced by what?
So typically, it's got to start with trust. So trust is vitally important in all this. So I mean, if you go right back, 2,000 years ago, Aristotle's work on rhetoric, talked about the three fundamentals of rhetoric. So ethos, pathos, logos. So logos is appealing to those logical faculties. Pathos is about the emotions, but it's ethos that I think we undercook the most right now, but it's the one that gives us the best chance of having someone be open to what it is that we're going to suggest. So ethos is a function of being credible and being trustworthy. And so as a leader, the core principle is people aren't going to listen to you until they like you, until there's a sense of trust. And so what are the things that cause trust, that trust reaction or response in someone else? Because that lays the foundation for them to be open-minded, to be willing to consider what you're suggesting. So if you look at Paul Zach's work, so Paul Zach, if you haven't heard of him, he's a great researcher at Claremont Graduate University over in California. He's essentially the first researcher decades ago now who started to study oxytocin. So that social bonding hormone, like how does it function? How does it operate? What's its half-life in our brains? I mean, his work is properly pioneering. So what he's looked at is how do you trigger oxytocin in someone else? So if you're going to have a connection that means that someone's going to be open, he's got some great insights, but one of the most simple insights from Paul Zach is the importance of getting in sync with another person. So synchronicity can be all sorts of things. It can be matching the mood, matching the vibe, showing points of commonality, but even the physical element of being in sync. And so I remember doing a podcast interview with him a few years ago and said, so if you're a leader and you've got someone who's resistant, they're digging their heels in, that just giving them more information, more evidence isn't going to open their minds. It'll probably cause them to double down. How do you get in sync with that person so oxytocin flows, trust builds? And he said, well, so we've done some research. We've found that clapping together and singing together is really useful. It's just why choirs and faith communities have often a strong cohesion because singing, clapping actually gets our brains in sync. I'm like, that's great. Not so useful if you're a leader with someone sitting opposite you. Can we just clap together briefly before we have the conversation? Doesn't work. So what does? So he said, interestingly, one of the most effective things, go for a walk. So because when you're walking side by side with someone, you will naturally get in step. You'll get in sync. You'll match their cadence. And when that happens, what the brain scans show is that oxytocin is released. They're far more open, more likely to consider what you're suggesting. So you can have someone telling a story, but if it's not their story, even if they're presenting it in a way that seems so compellingly true, if it's not true, unconsciously the other person figures it out. Unconsciously, our brains know that it's not authentic. There's something about the lack of alignment and congruity. And so they'll listen to it, but they're not as fully engaged. Their brains don't light up in the same way they would be if it was a real story.
This is something I'm really fascinated about in the world of influencers. One of the things right now that brands are trying to figure out is who can speak on our behalf. We brands in the 20th century, we spoke for ourselves. We went to the Madison Avenue advertising agency. We made the 30-second spot. We ran it on one of the big broadcast channels that the entire population was watching, and away we go. And that world has gone, and it's replaced with this fragmented world where consumers have more power, channels are infinite, and often it feels like content creators and influencers have a louder voice than brands. So look at something like the last US election. Everyone lost their minds when Taylor Swift, with her hundreds of millions of followers, came out and said, you know what, I think Kamala Harris. People couldn't believe that Taylor had taken a position, but she did. Then a much less significantly followed person, Joe Rogan, came out in favor of Trump. Now, Taylor Swift's following, from memory, is about 10 to 1 the size of Rogan's. But I think it's pretty clear that Rogan's endorsement had more impact on Trump's base and the waverers for Trump than Taylor Swift's endorsement had for Kamala Harris. So I look at your analysis of ethos and then I add a word which is sort of relevant ethos. Does that make sense to you?
Does,
that yes, we can have this sense of shared humanity and ethos and trust, but there's always this secondary question of, is that feeling relevant to the decision I have to make here? And I'm not sure people felt Taylor Swift's endorsement was relevant, whereas others thought Joe Rogan's was.
I think the interesting thing about ethos and persuasion generally is when someone is an unconventional ambassador, when they hold a position that isn't what you'd expect them to hold, That's what gets cut through. I think the reality is most people assume Taylor Swift would have been a Democrat-leaning human. So I think that doesn't get massive interest because it's like, well, of course she'd say that because we sort of assume that will probably be the case. When someone says something you're not expecting and they've got a profile and credential of being upfront and real, it's far more compelling.
What's a word that leaders should use more when they're trying to inspire minds to change?
Oh, what a great question. I've never, ever been asked this question, but it's a really good one. I want to give it proper thought. Yeah, so I've got an answer.
All right. One word. What is the one word that leaders should bear in mind when they're trying to change people's minds?
Well, I think actually probably one word that I learned from Dr. Kirsten Ferguson. I don't know if you've read her book, Blind Spotting, yet. She'd be a great person for the podcast, actually. She talks about the power of the word yet. Yet has such potency in it. So if, for instance, as a leader, you're saying, I don't know, we talked about curiosity and humility and openness, that's great. But don't just say, I don't know, yet at the end is absolutely critical. Because what yet does is it means I don't know, but I'm open and I'm keen to go on the journey together. It is at core that sort of growth mindset type thing. And I wonder how often we lead with openness and humility, but if it's just that complete laissez-faire, like, I don't know, what do you all think? That does lack the hard, strong edge that leaders need. Yet, at the end of that statement, is probably the key one.
Let's talk quickly about a little bit more about this notion of people preferring sometimes to feel right than be right. Do we know that that's what we're doing? When we are prioritizing the things that feel right rather than necessarily things that are right, are we conscious that's what we're doing? Or are we also using the big rational part of our brains to rationalize that the thing that we feel is right is also logically right?
Yeah, I think it all comes down to self-awareness. There will be many of us who have that ability to know that I'm holding a position right now that deep down I couldn't really defend, that I know probably isn't right, that is probably quite outdated, but I either couldn't be bothered changing it, or it's too hard to change, or to change in front of this particular person. Might be someone who has for years held that position and finally going, you know what, I'm suddenly realizing they're probably right. That's a moment of ego hit right there. So I think that even the most self-aware amongst us know that we're doing that, but find it hard to overcome that because it does require us to swallow our pride, to humble ourselves. But I do think the reality is a lot of us don't. And around different issues, we'll have blind spots. We'll have things where we essentially have contradictions within our beliefs that are never really brought into the light until someone like our kids are a great source of doing this. They'll challenge you and ask you about a view that you've got that doesn't line up with a value that you say matters to you. And I think we've all got those things, whether it's around social issues or political issues, and they're often just unexamined assumptions or belief systems that we haven't thought about for years, but they've become so a part of us. It's a muscle memory around them. So we instantly react to an article we read or a podcast we listen to or a conversation over at a social function out of reflex without actually stopping and thinking, do I actually really agree with that? I'm not sure if I do anymore. So I think certainly there is a sense in which we can be aware, but it's costly. But most of us do operate on autopilot. Those tribal instincts are so strong that I think there is a sense that for a lot of us, it's that reflex. And interestingly, that highly intelligent people are often the most prone to it because they've got the rational faculties to dig themselves in deeper and self-justify their beliefs. In fact, things like conspiracy beliefs, some of the strongest conspiracy belief adherents are highly educated, highly intelligent people. It's not a function of ignorance. Actually being super smart can be unhelpful.
I want to talk a bit about some of the new work you're doing around not just being open-minded, but living a life of curiosity and bringing an approach of curiosity, because to me, this is at the heart of it. And I know that at the heart of this for you are your indie experiments.
Yes, that's right.
Tell me about indie.
Yeah, so the core idea behind this is the best way to retrain your brain to be open, particularly if it doesn't come naturally to you because of your personality like me, or maybe your position where everyone's looking to you for answers all the time. So you tend to defer to being certain rather than curious. How do you try and retrain your brain? So the best way to do this is to microdose novelty. Introduce small elements of things that are unfamiliar that feel safe to your brain, because it's almost like It's almost like exposure therapy for people who've got like anxiety, for instance. You expose yourself to small doses of the thing that you're frightened of.
Dose is small enough so the amygdala doesn't freak out and start to...
Yeah. So you want to have it, that doesn't feel too threatening, but just pushes you a bit out of your comfort zone. So the indie experiment idea actually came from a conversation with a colleague of mine. So he's actually a retired Supreme Court barrister, incredibly intelligent, incredibly thoughtful. And I was chatting with him at an event, and I was just reflecting to him that despite his stature and how well regarded he is, talking to him, he is one of the most humble, open-minded, curious people, like just full of wonder. And he'd be in his late 80s now. Like, so even at a life stage, from a life stage perspective, often by the time you get to that point, you are quite fixed in your thinking. That's often the natural pattern for humans. And I said, how is that a thing? How are you so naturally curious? Is it your personality, or have you worked on it? And he said one of the things that he and his wife started doing a few years ago that's been a real help were these indie experiments. And I said, what's that? He said, well, it's basically a term that he coined. So I'd never do it. So indie stands for that. He said it's an acronym. It's choosing something to do regularly that you'd never do. So I said every Saturday we'd open the paper, we'd look at what was happening in Sydney that weekend, what was going on. And we think, of all the things happening in Sydney this weekend, what's the least likely thing here that we'd ever go to? And then we just turn up. And he said we went to a puppetry the penis one night. We went to a wrestling match. Like, these are very serious, high caliber, high profile people just being students, just wandering into life with that sense of what can we discover. So what have I probably got 70, 75 of these indie experiments, and some of them are super simple, like drinking bubble tea. Have you tried bubble tea?
I have.
I never had. I walk past all, I'm like, what is do you eat the little things on the bottom? Are they just there for decoration? So things like that, like you just small moments, like the week before last was at the airport, and rather than walking the normal way that I would go to the gate, I walked the other way. I'm like, I just discovered all these stores I didn't know at the domestic terminal. And it's only little things, but literally what it does is it trains your brain to see new and novel things or uncertainty, not as a threat, but as an invitation. It becomes fun.
I think my ultimate indie frontier would be walking slowly through an airport.
Walking slowly?
I would never do that.
You're like one of the racers. You're on the way somewhere.
So what have you noticed about your brain? What has shifted for you 70 plus indie experiments later? Are things changing?
Yes, definitely. So I reckon I would have noticed about probably 3 months in, I could feel that sense of, instead of the indie moment where I'm like, okay, this is what I'm going to do. I'm just going to grin and bear it. Okay, I'm going to force myself. Not that it was grueling at all, but it was just a little bit uncomfortable. It's like wearing an uncomfortable piece of clothing that was new. It was unfamiliar, to the point where it actually became exciting, became fun. And that's the benefit, is you do start to really shift your sense of what they call the tolerance of uncertainty. Your tolerance level goes up. And so I have noticed over the last little while, even the last couple of weeks, it's getting harder and harder to identify an indie experiment to do, because the list of things I'd never do is actually getting shorter, which is sort of the point. There are only 3 rules that I had when choosing indie experiments. I had to be something that wasn't harmful or hurtful, couldn't violate my values, and it had to be temporary. So no tattoos, for instance. But if it was anything else was like, bring it on. And so I have just found over the last little while it's getting harder, because that list of things I would never do is getting shorter, because I'm just much more open, looking like what's new, how can I learn? It just changes your posture toward the world around you. And apart from just being a fun and adventurous way to live, what's interesting about it, the reason it matters, is because when you've microdosed novelty, uncertainty in small amounts, when the proper stuff shows up, like a restructure at work, or the threat of AI, like making your profession irrelevant, or even the call from the doctor with bad news, like when proper uncertainty shows up, instead of freaking out or freezing, it's almost like you've built this muscle, this cognitive muscle to be able to go, okay, I know what to do because I've been in uncertain environments, and I can stay calm, I can be clear, I can be confident, and I can and the keyword's creative. Because when we're in survival freak out mode, our brains cannot be creative. And that's often the thing we need most in those moments when uncertainty shows up.
This whole podcast has been about change and how we deal with change and how we lead change. And we can be hopeful about the change that AI is going to bring to the economy. But we also know it's going to bring some profoundly uncomfortable change at best. Yep. And there are going to be people in what we might call the trades economy who will be maybe less affected. There'll be people in the care economy. But there are going to be people in the knowledge economy, what you referred to as sort of the white collar economy, that are going to do it tough. And potentially my thesis is we are less going to be building what used to look like conventional careers, and we're more going to be building these personal knowledge sets and personal brands and personal reputations that we carry with us into the future. And we don't quite know what that future is going to hold, but we've got to figure out what value we take into that future. How does the story we tell ourselves about what a career looks like, how does that story need to change?
So I think there's a couple of things involved there. Firstly, and it's not new, this idea that having a career for life is definitely something that we will see almost disappear entirely. I mean, our kids and grandkids will talk about long service leave. They'll be like, what the hell was that? Long service leave. What an amazing
Is that after the first year?
That's right. You've stayed for 2 seasons, winter and spring. But it's certainly that will disappear, but that's not new. We've seen that been happening for 2 generations now. Started with Gen Y or millennials, and now certainly Gen Z. To me, the bigger theme is if we go to a point where, and there was an interview I watched with Jamie Dimon last week, JP Morgan CEO, he talked about within 20 years, it's like there's every likelihood people are working 3.5 days a week. Then we fly past the 4-day work week, 3.5 days a week. We'll have probably a lot more AI doing some of the things that are the grunt work things we need to do now. If we do see a hollowing out of that sort of that white collar professional class, there is talk about, do we think about careers very differently? Is it necessarily about universal basic income? Do we need to have other support networks involved for people who, wide scale or let go? Let's say that's the worst case scenario. And even if there's just a period of time, a lag time where we've got to reskill the population to be able to use some of the technology to stay relevant, in that lag time, how do we do that? And my concern with all the conversations about universal basic income, and it goes back to something we talked about before, is that you can make sure people have got the money to live and be somewhat comfortable and self-sufficient. But what else does work give you apart from money? It's so much about community, purpose, and the big one's dignity, that idea that I'm producing something and contributing here. And so to me, the bigger concern over the next 5 to 10 years, especially when you overlay that with some of the stuff we're already seeing with Gen Z, which is that level of isolation, even the growing level of, and this is a strong word, but I think it's an important word, hopelessness, or sometimes helplessness you see in Gen Z. No matter what I do, I'm never going to be able to buy a house. I'm never going to be able to have the career or the life my parents had. When you see that en masse in a generation of young people, that is profoundly worrying for a society. Hope is so vital for the human soul. And so to me, it's about, you might be able to have economic stopgaps. What else, though, is removed when potentially AI disrupts people's sense of career? Because it's not just about the money, it's about all the other things around that are harder to recreate.
So you've taken us to a huge place, a place
Yes.
of hope and purpose and possibility and dignity and all the things that are potentially going to threaten that. And we haven't even talked about the planetary and environmental threats to that, or the geopolitical instability and the threats to that. There's a lot to worry about right now. So let's finish by coming back to things that we can do. And often in the face of challenging situations, whether it's a politician trying to advocate for tax reform or for a universal basic income, or whether it's a activist trying to campaign for positive measures to deal with climate change, or whether it's a business leader saying the way that our business has been working is not going to keep working forever, we need to make change. It strikes me that they're asking people in that moment, all of those leaders are asking people to trade one type of loss for another. They're saying at the moment, loss is happening to us. We are losing the ability we're losing control in some way. We are losing control of our future. But this is happening to us. And in order to mitigate that loss, I, as a leader, am asking you to choose to come with me on this. And now that second loss is a loss that I'm asking you to choose. And even if I'm out raising money for a new company, I'm asking that investor to lose something, which is hand over a check. Well, you've lost that money. You might in the future get it back, but right now how do we get people to value correctly that relationship between loss that's happening to them and a loss or a sacrifice? Perhaps that's a better word, because all strategy involves sacrifice. Let's finish by talking about how we get people to lean in and go, yes, I understand that. I understand that there is sacrifice involved. There is pain involved. There is unfamiliarity involved, or whatever it is. But nonetheless, I choose to go with you. I choose that.
I think a couple of things that always help: absolute honesty. Call out the loss. Acknowledge that this is going to be difficult, and I understand it. Even just having people feel like someone understands the emotion I'm feeling, and Chris Foss's work around how do you deal with high tense situations negotiation wise, if you call out the emotion that the person is feeling, it somewhat dissipates the power of that emotion. So calling it out and acknowledging that that's a reality, I think is a really important starting point. There is anxiety, there is fear. Let's not paper over that or diminish it. Let's speak to that and be very honest. Then, of course, the question is, which emotions will you appeal to? And there are some sugar hit emotions that will get you instant reaction. And there are emotions like fear. There are emotions like outrage. There are emotions like disgust. And those will get an instant reaction. We've seen political leaders appeal to them beautifully. They play the population like a fiddle. They appeal to all those base emotions. Now, they'll get you a short-term impact, but typically it's a narrowing response. So we're getting closer and closer on protection and how do we keep what we've got. The other emotions like hope and joy, patriotism, pride, these are emotions that are hard. They'll give you a longer-term impact, but they don't give you the sugar hit up front. So you can deal with the fear and the disgust and some of those sort of darker emotions. They can get an instant response, but their half-life is quick. And the response, the ash of those emotions afterwards is often quite toxic. It takes a strong leader to realize, how do we appeal to hope and to joy and to patriotism? That's where we need to be playing.
And I think to be really sort of selfish for me, the way I process what you've just said is in the short term, slogans can have an impact.
Yeah.
But to have that long-term effect on people, we need to tell them stories.
Yeah. Yep.
And we need to tell stories that are rich and true and real and full of hope and purpose and humility and possibility.
Yeah.
And maybe just then they will go with us on
Yep.
the difficult, uncomfortable change that needs to be made.
Yeah, I love it. I thought you'd make that connection because I think it's so true.
Michael McQueen, thank you so much.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Storywork was brought to you in partnership with Slingshot. As you've heard in today's episode, stories really matter, and there is no story more important than the one you tell your customers. But finding the right time, place, channel, and medium through which to tell that story is critical, and that's where my great friends at Slingshot come in. Slingshot pride themselves on developing creative media strategies to propel their clients further, faster. You can find out more about the brilliant work that Slingshot does, helping brands find their audiences, tell their stories, and achieve their objectives at slingshot.com.au. And talking about finding out more, you can find out more about this and every episode of Storywork, including all the show notes and all of my key learnings from every conversation over on Substack.